conquest needed to be ratified, and that his veterans would need land upon their return to Italy. Caesar had already distinguished himself as one of the few senators to support Pompey's grant of Mediterranean Imperium to fight the pirates a few years earlier, and spent his time now backing whatever Pompey indicated he required. With his eye on the consulship, and his dreams of reforming practically everything about the way the empire was administered, Caesar was keenly aware of the need for powerful friends. His populist stances and obviously high ambition had won him no friends in the Senate. If he was going to do half of what he planned, he would need a way to blunt the obstructionist senators. Caesar recognized Pompey as the perfect ally, a wildly popular general who made the Senate as queasy as Caesar seemed to make them. By supporting Pompey now, Caesar hoped that when the general came home, the favor would be returned. When his praetorship ended, Caesar was named proconsular governor of Hispania Ulterior, or Further Spain, a province that hugged the southern coast of Spain from roughly modern-day Valencia to the Atlantic. The governorship was a turning point in Caesar's career. It gave him his first crack at true military command, which, as you can imagine, he excelled at brilliantly. But it also set him up in a position to really make some money. Governorships of the provinces during this period was seen by most Roman politicians as their reward for the sacrifices and financial investments they had made on behalf of the state over the course of their careers. The personal milking of the provinces was not a scandal unless it reached egregious proportions. It was one of the things Caesar intended to change if he was ever given the chance. Anyone who thought about it could see that the annual arrival of some new governor who planned to make himself rich on the backs of the provincials was not a sustainable practice. Eventually, the cow would be milked dry. But, while it was something Caesar intended to change, he had major debts to worry about. So upon arrival, he promptly picked a fight with the hill tribes in the west that had never been fully pacified and drove them off, seizing the lucrative silver mines they controlled at the same time. This meant more revenue for the state, massive amounts of cash for Caesar himself, and, bonus, territorial expansion for the empire, the thing that triumphs are made of. And upon completion of this little war in Spain, Caesar demanded just that. The Senate had no desire to grant Caesar his triumph, but there was no denying what he had accomplished. But Caesar further indicated that he intended to run for the consulship that year as well. The prospect of the wildly popular Caesar returning in triumph from Spain and immediately taking the reins of power petrified the Senate. But what could they do? Into this dilemma stepped Cato the Younger, leader of the conservative faction in the Senate, defender of republican virtue, and implacable foe of Caesar, who proposed a way to at least hold off Caesar's consulship. In order to qualify for candidacy, a man had to be physically present in Rome. But if a returning general entered the city before his triumph, the honor was nullified and the great victory parade cancelled. As Caesar waited at Rome's gates, Cato did everything in his power to put the triumph off until after the deadline for candidate filing. Caesar asked for an exception to the rule, but the request was denied. Cato went so far as to filibuster all business on the final day of the senatorial session to prevent the triumph from being scheduled prior to the deadline. Cato left that evening feeling quite satisfied with himself. Surely vain Caesar would not pass up an opportunity for a triumph, which may only come around once in a lifetime, just to run for an office he was destined to win anyway. Imagine his shock when Caesar, bold and unpredictable Caesar, abandoned his opportunity for a triumph and entered the city. He would stand for election that year, an election he would win handily to serve as consul of Rome in 59 BC. Next week, we will delve into Caesar's eventful term in office, the reforms he tried to implement, and the reforms the Senate did everything in their power to block. But Caesar's support of Pompey did indeed pay off, and his long-standing relationship with Crassus was formalized in a secret pact to push forward the aims of all three men. The secret pact did not remain secret for long, though, for when Caesar stood before the popular assembly in order to bypass the opposition Senate, he was flanked by both Pompey and Crassus. It was instantly clear that the three most powerful men in Rome were working together, and as the masses cheered, the Senate cringed. How in the world could they stop this political juggernaut? Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 40, in the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Last week, we followed Julius Caesar's rise up to cursus honorum, which was capped by a successful election of the consulship for a term to be served in 59 BC. Lavishly, bribed when necessary, made a lot of friends, and even more enemies. More than anything else, he had established himself as a man to be reckoned with. He was an able governor and a brilliant military commander, a master orator, and a shrewd politician. For most Romans, the consulship marked the end of a long career. For Julius Caesar, it was only the beginning. The consular elections that saw Caesar emerge triumphant was a dirty affair, one that saw rampant bribery on all sides. It was obvious that Caesar was going to win in a walk, so the important thing to the conservative Senate was to elect someone who would stand as a bulwark against any radical reforms they suspected Caesar would try and push through. To this end, they threw all their support behind Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, who had served as aedile alongside Caesar years earlier, and forever bore a grudge against his former colleague for taking credit for things Bibulus himself had accomplished while in that office. That personal enmity, coupled with a naturally conservative worldview, made him the perfect foil for Caesar's charismatic populism. In anticipation of the struggle with the Senate, Caesar had been lining up support across the Roman world, men at all levels of society who would back him through thick and thin. Some because they genuinely believed in Caesar's programs, some simply out of crass self-interest. Caesar spread bribes liberally and promises of patronage constantly. It made no matter to him. A vote was a vote was a vote, whether it came unsolicited or after a massive payoff. At the top of his pyramid of support, Caesar targeted three powerful men specifically. The first of these men was an obvious choice. Marcus Crassus had been a longtime backer of Caesar, and their alliance was already well known. But it bears repeating that Crassus was exceedingly wealthy and still dreamed of becoming a great military commander. Second, Caesar targeted Pompey the Great, who had struggled upon returning from the east to have his conquest ratified and his veterans settled. It took some deft maneuvering on Caesar's part to get Crassus and Pompey in the same room, but both were well aware that their own personal projects and aspirations could be realized easier with the help of the other. Last, Caesar made overtures to Rome's greatest lawyer and orator, Cicero. He appealed to Cicero's vision, intelligence, and legal savvy. The empire as presently constituted was unsustainable. Cicero could see that as well as anyone. But the conservative Senate resisted all attempts at desperately needing reform. Caesar was offering Cicero the chance to have great influence over the course correction he planned for the empire. But Cicero rejected the mutual support pact, preferring to remain an independent, moderate voice. Thus was born the first triumvirate. Not its name at the time, nor a particularly accurate description of the wide network of supporters Caesar had aligned, but history gives us our shorthand labels, and is often easier to simply use them rather than try to reinvent the wheel. The agreement between Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey was made official when they swore a solemn oath, administered by Caesar in his role as Pontifex Maximus, to undertake no action that opposed any of the others. Pretty simple, right? Well, actually, yeah, it was pretty simple, and it worked too. With his support lined up, Caesar wrapped up some unfinished business in his personal life. He needed to find a new wife. I neglected the scandal that led to his divorce from his second wife, Pompeia, last week, so before we delve into the details of Caesar's eventful consulship, I want to slide back a few years, as the man who sparked the scandal will feature prominently in the coming breakdown of civility between Caesar and Cicero. Each year, the rites of Bona Dea, the Roman goddess of fertility and healing, were performed in the home of Pontifex Maximus. Men were excluded from the ceremony, so Caesar was out of the house, leaving his wife and mother in charge of the proceedings. Into this segregated affair slipped Publius Clodius Pulcher, a free-thinking, flamboyant loose cannon who loved thumbing his nose at stodgy Roman tradition. Clodius, dressed as a woman, lingered on the edges of the party until he was outed by Caesar's mother. It would have been bad enough for Caesar had the ceremony he sponsored simply been desecrated. But to make matters worse, it was widely rumored that Clodius was engaged in an affair with Pompeia and was taking Caesar's absence as an opportunity for a rendezvous. In response to the destructive chatter, Caesar acted quickly. He divorced Pompeia, for, whether she was guilty of the affair or not, quote, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. The affair marked the last we will hear of Pompeia, but not the last we will hear of Clodius. I will also take this opportunity to note that while Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, Caesar himself was under no such obligation. Caesar cheated early and often on all of his wives, carrying on affairs with some of the most prominent women in Rome, including Servilia Caepionis, who was at the same time the mother and mother-in-law of Caesar's two most famous assassins, Brutus and Cassius, respectively. While the affair was on, though, she was best known as the half-sister of Cato the Younger. Caesar played politics to win and knew he was getting Cato's goat, hopefully forcing the staunch conservative, in his personal rage and embarrassment, to get sloppy. Caesar finally settled on marrying the daughter of the statesman Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who would coincidentally follow Caesar in the consulship the next year. And with Calpurnia by his side, Caesar took the oath of office in 59 BC, immediately setting to work on his reform program. First up, as agreed to by the three triumvirs, was a land redistribution program aimed primarily at Pompey's veterans, but further intended to alleviate the general problem of urban poverty that had become a chronic disease in Rome. Since the closing days of the Punic War, land ownership in Italy had become more and more centralized into fewer and fewer hands. The large landowning nobles further exacerbated the problem by importing slaves to work their estates rather than relying on a sharecropping system that would have kept locals tied to the land. These displaced ex-farmers flooded into Rome, putting enormous strain on the treasury and contributing to a general atmosphere of lawlessness in the growing slums and housing projects. And with so many of the landless being ex-soldiers, the possibility of violent uprisings was always just a few missed meals away. Caesar entered for the Senate's consideration a carefully written bill to address the issue. State-owned land would be opened up to settlement and stabling sellers at the land's assessed value. The money to do this would come from the treasure Pompey had brought back with him from the east, making the project cost neutral. In order to mollify the change-adverse Senate, Caesar specifically exempted the rich lands of Campania, which had long been owned and operated by the nobles of Rome for their personal enrichment. But the exemption was not enough, and the Senate, though unable to voice a single constructive criticism of the bill, nonetheless stalled its passage. If they let Caesar pass such a popular bill, his influence would skyrocket off the charts, and they simply could not allow that to happen. Cato rose in opposition and began to talk, and talk, and talk, and talk. Pretty soon, it was clear that he intended to talk until the sun fell out of the sky. The merits of the bill were no longer in question. This was a naked stall tactic, pure and simple. Caesar grew impatient, and then enraged at Cato, and in his fury made one of his few political miscalculations. He ordered that Cato be seized and hauled off to jail for obstructing senatorial business. The Senate was understandably shocked at one of their most respected members being hauled off to jail like a common criminal, and in protest walked out of the session en masse. Caesar caught a member who he knew to be at least sympathetic to his cause and asked why he too was leaving. The senator replied, "I would rather be in jail with Cato than here with you." This harsh statement, coming